What I want to do, because this is such an important part of what you're going to be doing in 202 and 303, I want to start talking about chord progressions, and I want to show you a resource that can help you. So I'm going to share my screen with you. The first thing you're going to see on here is you have these voice ranges. Now, these are not the ranges that a vocalist can actually sing, but these are the ranges that the textbook and most theory textbooks will use for 4-part writing. So your soprano range, the first thing I want to point out, it goes from this C4 here. Remember, this would be C5, and it goes all the way up to this G5 at the top. So you want to keep all of your soprano voices when we're writing in 4 parts between the C and the G. The other thing I want to point out is notice how the soprano has the stems facing up. You want to make sure your soprano stems, even if it's the only voice, if it's for the soprano voice, for our purposes, you want to make sure those stems are always facing up. It kind of takes some of the guesswork out of how your stem should face, right? So if we look at the alto, you've got this G3 down here. It goes all the way up to the D5. And notice the stems on the alto will always face down. So if we go and look down here at number 1, you'll notice the soprano part, your B up to C. We can clearly see that's a soprano because the stems are facing up. The G holding across to the other G, I know that's the alto because it's in the treble clef and the stems are facing down. So those are 2 requirements for this. You want to make sure when you're doing 4-part writing that your soprano voice always has those stems up and the alto is always marked with the stems down. And you always want to make sure the soprano and the alto are in the treble clef. You don't want to write them in the bass clef. Even though we go way below middle C here, that's just how we're going to do it for this class. That's the lowest note you can use in the alto though. Okay. So then same thing with the bass and the tenor. You'll notice the tenor is our next highest voice. It goes from a C3 all the way up to a G4. So if you were to write this in the alto clef, it would be right here. That's your G4, so they do overlap. But you want to make sure that the stems on these, just like the soprano, are facing up. And then the bass stems will always face down, and you can go from an E2 to a D4. So you do want to memorize these. These are sort of the standard ranges that are used in most music theory textbooks, as I've already said. So it's important to memorize this. At most, other textbooks might go up to an A in the soprano. The alto, the tenor, and the bass pretty much stay the same though. Although the bass, you might have an F instead of an E. So we actually have a wider range for our courses here at UNLV at least. Okay, any questions about that? About how you would actually write your 4-part harmonies here? So when we write chord progressions, we're writing them in 4 parts. We're really writing them for voice, and we want to be very careful how we approach something known as voice leading. So if you have a 5 chord going to the 1 chord, like we see right here, you'll notice that the 5 chord has this leading tone, right? If you're in the key of C, the leading tone is always the 7th scale degree. That's how you identify the leading tone, okay? It is also going to be the 3rd of the 5 chord. So if we were to write this out, you've got your G and your D, that's your root and your 5th. The 3rd is right here, your B. So that B always resolves up. I'm typically not going to refer to it as a 7th scale degree because that confuses it with the 7th of the chord. So I'm typically going to call this a leading tone, and I want you to learn, memorize. If you learn only one thing today, learn that the leading tone resolves up. So if you notice in our example here, we have this B, our leading tone, and it just comes up by step. We're also going to be talking about doublings a little bit. So when you have a root position triad, typically what you want to do is you want to double the root of the chord. There's going to be some exceptions to this, but right now I want to try and make this as simple as possible. We're not dealing with any diminished triads right now. You're going to find that when you have a diminished triad, you don't actually double the root because it emphasizes that tritone in the bass. But I don't want you to worry about that yet. I just want you to memorize that in root position triads, whenever possible, we double the root, or you can double the fifth of the chord, but whenever possible, you really want to double that root. The fifth is only if you don't have any other options. When you have a first inversion triad, typically you're going to double the bass. You could also double the fifth in a first inversion, but again, we want to generally avoid that. So we're just going to go step by step through this, and it might be confusing right now, but with practice, it'll become more clear. But let's just look at our first chord progression here. So we have a 5 chord. The way we figure that out is basically if you have a staff, let's put in the treble clef here. Each note of the major scale is a scale degree. So this is scale degree 1, this is 2, this is 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So we've got 7 scale degrees to work with. If I tell you to write a chord on the 5th and the 1st scale degree, what you do is you count up to the 5th scale degree of whatever key you're in, and you build a triad. So here on the 5th scale degree, I've got the notes G, B, and D. We call that our 5 or our dominant chord. So your dominant is your 5 chord. If you want to build a chord on the 1st scale degree, the 1 chord, then you'd go back to the 1st scale degree and you'd build a triad on scale degree 1. So we call that the tonic. There's actually a name for every single one of these scale degrees, but right now you need to learn the 1 chord and the 5 chord, the tonic and the dominant. Those are all we're working with for the next 2 or 3 weeks. Even when we get into half cadences, as you can see there, all those chords are either a 1 or a 5. So we're going to be working a lot with the dominant and the tonic. Now, the thing about the tonic, if you look at the notes, you've got C, E, and G. So in the key of C, there's no leading tone on the 1 chord. So there's no tendency tone. A tendency tone, this is another term for you. It's any tone that has a tendency to want to resolve a certain way. So the one tendency tone I've talked to you about so far is a leading tone. There are other tendency tones too, but right now, just memorize that the tendency tone is the leading tone. And the leading tone, as we know, it resolves up. There is only one instance where the leading tone doesn't resolve up, and that's something we'll talk about much later. So for now, just know that your tendency tones have a tendency to want to resolve a particular way, and the leading tone always wants to resolve up. And if we look at this, if this, this B here, our 7th scale degree, I'm going to make it blue. If that's your leading tone, it wants to resolve back to scale degree 1. So it always wants to go back to the tonic. It has a strong pull towards the tonic. It's that minor second relationship that makes that happen. Plus our own understanding of tonality. We kind of have this tonal memory that makes us want to come back to the 1 chord. So that leading tone always comes up. So if you'll notice, in every single one of these, look for the B, look for the leading tone. Notice how it resolves up to 1. In the next chord progression, it's the same chord progression, it's still a 5-1. The B still resolves up. Here, it's in the tenor. The tenor resolves up. Here, we have another leading tone. It resolves up. Leading tone in measure 9. It resolves up. And then here, the leading tone is actually in the bass, and the chord progression resolves it for us. So if you write a 5-6 chord, that means it's in first inversion. So the 3rd should be in the bass. B is the third of your 5 chord. So we put that in the bass, and then when it resolves to 1, it naturally resolves up. So if we wrote this as a 5-6 going to a 1-6, we wouldn't actually be able to write that chord progression because the leading tone wouldn't resolve. And no composer does that in the classical, let's just say the tonal music, because it's really the classical, romantic, baroque, and some modern music as well. So that's your first thing. What you want to make sure is that your leading tone always resolves up. And you'll notice in every single one of these, the leading tone resolved up. So the way I approach these when I write a chord progression is I look at the Roman numerals that I have to resolve. So here I've got a 5 and a 1 chord. So the first thing I do is, maybe if I need a little extra help, and if you're just starting out, go ahead and write your 5 chord and your 1 chord on a separate staff. Just write them in root position. And then what we can do is we can make sure we account for all the notes. Now, the first thing you should notice that in 4-part writing, you have 4 voices, but there's only 3 members of the triad. So because of that, one of these members has to be doubled. So I told you that you always want to double the root. So we're going to look at this, and we're going to see if that actually applies in all these chord progressions. So the first thing you want to do, let's just check these. You've got a G here. I'll make these a different color. So there's your root in measure 1, and there's your root. Here's your C, and here's your other C. So we double the root in both of those. So in measure 6, we've got the bass, the G, it is doubled. You've got your C, it's also doubled. Here's your G, we've doubled it. Here's your C, it's been doubled here in the tenor. Here we've got another G, it's been doubled. Your C has been doubled. Here you have a G and another G. Here you have your C, and they doubled that up there. And here our root is still going to be G, and we're still doubling it. And our root for the 1 chord is C. So they have fulfilled that obligation for all of these chord progressions. We doubled the root in every single one. So the way I typically approach this is I write in the bass first. If I need a little extra help and I want to make sure I'm keeping track of everything, I write my chords out on a separate staff in a single clef, just to make it really easy. And I mark off the notes as I put them in. So I start with my bass, and let's say I go ahead and I write my G in. So then I go over here and I mark off one of my G's so that I know that I've already used that G. So then I put in my 1 chord, the bass note of my 1 chord. Oops. So then I go to my next chord, I mark off one of my C's so that I know that's been taken care of. The next thing I do is I resolve any of my tendency tones. So the only tendency tone that I have to deal with right now is the leading tone. So what I do is I go over, and it doesn't matter what voice I put it in. If I want a perfect authentic cadence, I want to put my leading tone in the highest voice, right? Oh, you actually don't know about cadences yet. That's okay. So you can put your leading tone in any voice. As you see here in measure 1 and measure 2, it's in the soprano. In measure 7, it's in the tenor. Measure 8, it's in the tenor. Measure 9, it's in the alto. And in measure 10, it's in the bass. So literally you can put your leading tone anywhere. You do have to pay attention to the chord progression though. So this one, we don't have a choice but to put it in the bass. The others, we do have a choice. So I just write in my B, and I cross off my B over here so that I don't accidentally use it again. And then I throw in my C for the next chord because I know it has to resolve. So now I'm only left with 2 notes in each chord. So the next thing you want to do is you always want to hold the common tone, if there is a common tone. There won't always be a common tone, but when you're moving from 5 to 1, there is going to be a common tone. So you look at this chord progression up here, just your chords in root position, and you see that you have a G and another G. So your G is going to be your common tone. So what I do is I take and I put that in any voice I want. In this case, it's in the alto. In measure 6, it's down here in the tenor. In measure 7, it's in the soprano. It doesn't matter how you voice it. The way you voice it could make the chord stronger or weaker, but you can really voice it any way you want for now. There will be certain restrictions later. If I ask you to make a particular type of cadence, you'll have to voice it one way. Okay, so we mark off our G's because we used them, and then I just put in my D going up to my E, and I cross those off. And so now I have a complete chord progression. So as long as you move by step, notice how all 3 upper voices in each one of these chord progressions, they are not skipping, except for the last one. There is no leaping, there's no skipping in the upper 3 voices. If you skip or leap, moving from 5 to 1, you probably did something wrong, or you're dealing with this particular progression, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So you always want to check to make sure there is stepwise motion, and you should never have more than a skip. Like here you get a skip, that's actually okay. The bass will have to skip. It often does jump around, so that's okay for the bass. All right, so if we look at measure 10, we run into a little bit of a problem, because I'm going to go ahead and actually write this out again, just to be really thorough and show you how all this works. We still want to double the bass note. We still want our B and our D, and we still want to double the bass note of the 1 chord and include our 3rd and 5th. So if we look at this last one here, just gonna start over with this one. This last one, they told us the bass note to put in. So I'm still going to go ahead. I'm still going to put my bass note in, and I'm still going to go over here, and I'm going to get rid of that B so that I know I used it. I also have a 1 chord, which tells me that I have to have a C in the bass. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to cross off one of my C's. So I still want my leading tone to resolve, but that's already been done in the bass. So now I want to make sure that I hold my common tone over. We're still going to do that. So in this case, I've got a G here and a G here, and I'm just going to go ahead and put that in the next voice up. So now I've got 2 more chord members. I've got a G and a D and a C and an E. So in order to make this work out, I'm actually going to have to double my G here, still going to double that root. And I'm just going to go ahead and put my D in the soprano. But now what you notice is you've got a C and an E left in this particular chord progression. So if we want to move by step, our best option is to take this D and just move it down into the C. So we get rid of that C there and we get rid of our D. And then we only have 1 chord member left. We can't leave out the 3rd, so we can't hold that G over. So what we end up having to do is skip down a 3rd. Okay, so this is something that we are going to be spending a lot of time on. I kind of gave you a crash course in all of this, but I'm going to just talk about one more thing here, and then that will be it for today, because I don't want to overwhelm you with too much information. All right. So there's one other thing we need to talk about. You'll see on top here, we've got a perfect authentic cadence, an imperfect authentic cadence, and a contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadence. So there are different types of cadences in music. Oops. The ones we're talking about right now are purely our authentic cadences. So on the most general level, every single one of these chord progressions is an authentic cadence. What makes them perfect or imperfect is how these cadences unfold. So perfect authentic cadence, sorry, an authentic cadence in general is anything that moves from 5 to 1. If you see a 5-1 chord progression at the end of a phrase, that's an important distinction. It needs to come at the end of a phrase, then we call it some type of authentic cadence. But then you can have a perfect, you can have an imperfect, and then there's another category down here on the end called a contrapuntal imperfect. So these are all types of authentic cadences. So what makes a perfect cadence perfect is if you have 5-1 root motion in the bass. So notice we have the G in the bass and the C in the bass. It moves from 5 to 1 in root position. So you need to have root movement in the bass. The other thing that makes it perfect is you end on scale degree 1 in the soprano. So if we look at this and measure 1 and 2, these are both perfect authentic cadences because we've got that 5-1 motion in the bass. This one's just going in contrary motion. But they both have that leading tone resolving up to the tonic. You could also technically have scale degree 2 coming down to scale degree 1. But you need to make sure that scale degree 1 is in the soprano. That's what makes it perfect. Imperfect authentic is where you have scale degree 3 or 5 in the soprano, or where you don't have root motion in the bass. So if you look at measure 7, 8, and 9, in measure 7, we have scale degree 5. In measure 8, scale degree 3, and measure 9, scale degree 3. So these are all imperfect authentic cadences because you still have this root movement and this progression from 5 to 1, but we don't end on scale degree 1 in the soprano. That's the only thing that makes them imperfect versus perfect. And at the end of most phrases, at the end of a piece, you typically have the perfect authentic cadence waiting for you. So there's only one other type of imperfect authentic cadence. We call it contrapuntal. And a contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadence just moves by step in the bass. So in this case, we move from B up to C, but you could also, technically you could have a fifth coming down to the C as well. As long as you have stepwise motion in the bass, we call it contrapuntal. So those are your 3 types of cadences. So we'll spend several weeks on this because if you understand this, this keeps coming back in different ways.